All right, welcome back. So today we're going to look at the Plymouth colony. We're going to break this up into two parts. This is part one. Now, you guys already know a decent amount about the Plymouth colony because I know for a fact that you've heard about the Mayflower. And no, I'm not talking about the restaurant, the seafood restaurant in Asheboro called the Mayflower. We're talking about the actual ship, the Mayflower. Yet, I'm not hating on the restaurant. I'm not hating on the restaurant. I used to go there a lot when I was a kid. All right, so let's go ahead and let's jump in. So, a couple things I want you to know right off the bat. There are a few terms that are going to be used for the same group of people. Now, we typically refer to these people just as the Pilgrims. When people ask you about the Plymouth colony, or typically when people are talking about Thanksgiving, they refer to those people, those English people, as the Pilgrims. Now, during this time in England, they're going to be known by uh, really pilgrim is not going to be like what they're actually known as. That happens more so in retrospect, which means like looking back. So let's look at these three terms. The first term is separatists, and this is more so, this is one of the terms that the Pilgrims were more so known as, the separatists. A separatist is a group wanting to separate from a larger group. So in this case, we're going to be looking at the reason of religion. So this is a group, a religious group wanting to separate from a larger group. So this is where you see like sects, sects, sects of different religions spawning from larger ones. Almost like a denomination. Like you have, you had the Catholic Church. So let's do a little background. So before Martin Luther and the 95 Theses, you had the Catholic Church, and that was like Christianity. That was it. From there, after Martin Luther has his dealings with the Catholic Church, writes the 95 Theses. That's where you start to have different sects, again sects, of the church kind of split in different directions. You have people separating from the church and starting their own, new denominations. The ones that follow Martin Luther are going to be known as Lutherans. So let's actually skip down to the third one right here, Puritans, because this is, all right, so the Puritans, which are English Protestants of the 16th and 17th century that sought to purify the Church of England, purify. Okay, there you go. That's a little word association for you. So the Puritans are separating from the Church of England. The Church of England, the way that we know religion in the United States is much different than religion has been practiced around the world for millennia. You belonged to the Church of England, and that's it. There was no other option. That's one of the reasons why the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in the United States of America is unlike any document ever before it, because it gives people the opportunity to worship differently. And the biggest reason for this is because one of the main settlers, or the main settlements, I should say, one of the main settlements in the Americas, which would turn into the United States, was set up because the Puritans wanted to practice religion, again, worship God in their own way, and had just had fundamentally different beliefs about God than the Church of England did. So the Puritans are separating from the Church of England, which leads them to becoming pilgrims. A pilgrim is a person that journeys for religious reasons. That's it. That is what a pilgrim is. There is not. So when we talk about the Pilgrims, we're actually just talking about the fact that they were leaving England for religious reasons. Like, that is what quantifies them, or that is what makes them pilgrims. But again, they are other things as well. They are separatists because they are separating from the Church of England. They are Puritans because, again, this is essentially what they call themselves, and what others call them. That they are that group. that separatist group is the Puritans, because they want to purify the Church of England. They have very different fundamental beliefs in the Church of England. So they are leaving England to go to the Americas, which makes them pilgrims. All right. So it's good that we know, or we have to know, that these three terms are used to describe one group. Because if not, then we're going to get really confused and really kind of bogged down and lose some of the content and the context in which we're going to talk about, uh, over today and tomorrow. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to our next slide. Okay, so a little bit of background. So as we've already discussed, as we've already discussed, the English colonists did not agree with the Church of England. They wanted to worship God in their own way and wanted to separate, I should say from, not form, from the Church of England. Now, again, this is not allowed in England. This is how religion worked throughout the world. Not just in England. Now, I will say this, in like Africa, again, because it's so tribal at this time, you don't have like established like religions that you have to practice outside of just like certain tribes and certain tribal nations. It's honestly kind of the same throughout the Americas. Again, like they have their own like distinct religions, but they vary so much from tribe to tribe that there's not like, there's not any uniformity. While in Europe, that is exactly the case. Like there is, everyone belongs to this. And essentially in the Americas and in Africa, it was kind of similar in a sense that everyone in that tribe prescribed to the same religion. Like you didn't have people living amongst each other that that were like Buddhists, and some that were Christian, and some that were Jewish, and some that were Hindi. Like you didn't. That's not. America is one of the reasons, or one of the, I guess, I don't know how do I want to put this. America is kind of that melting pot where we start to have, again, many different groups of many different religious groups kind of living amongst each other, sometimes in harmony and sometimes not. So, and speaking of Asia, Asia is a little bit different when it comes to religion. And we talk about this in my philosophy class. It's not that they are not religious. They view religion as being very much part of the material world as well. So just to make that a little bit more clear, in Western philosophy, so we're talking about like from Europe this way. In Western philosophy, there is the belief that there are two realities. There is the material world, which we can, see, feel, touch, and then there's the spiritual world, which, is not visible, is not touchable, smellable. I don't know. You have the spiritual world and you have the material world. In Eastern philosophy, that is all one. Everything that is material is also spiritual. So there's just a very fundamental difference between how both sides of the world, how they view, spirituality and religion. So because the Puritans were not allowed to separate from the Church of England, they decided to go to America and to create a new colony for themselves. The Puritans were very much persecuted in England because they were seen as outcasts. Again, if everybody belongs to the same group, and everyone is prescribed to worship the same ways, each church, like we say Church of England, we're not talking about everybody goes to one church. We're talking about how there are multiple churches, but they're all under the same umbrella. And the Puritans are kind of outside that umbrella. And so they are looked at as being lesser people. So they decide to go to the Americas, and they have to receive funding. That actually kind of tried to travel around Europe and find a new place to live. They went to Amsterdam in the Netherlands. They had also, I'm trying to think, they went several places in Europe trying to find a place that they could worship freely, but they didn't see that as an option. So that is why they decided to go to the Americas. So the 102 people that make up the Separatists, the Puritans, the Pilgrims that will make their voyage to America and set up the Plymouth colony, the 102 people, are mainly made up of families. And this is different than what we have seen thus far. When we talked about Columbus and those early expeditions, again, those were all men, those were all people that were going there to make money. Okay. When we looked at the Roanoke colony, now we did see families there. We did see families there. And so what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that there is the idea and the goal of creating a permanent colony. I don't think I have to explain it too much. You are not going to, how do I want to put this? You are not going to create offspring with just men. Or you are not going to create offspring with just women. You have to have both. And that is what repopulates an area. And again, it is the young taking care of the old, and it's just a continuous cycle, right? And then Jamestown, again, the first settlers were all men. And why was that a problem? Well, it was all a problem because, again, they just went over there to make money. It wasn't an attempt to make it, it wasn't the main goal of it wasn't to create a permanent colony until women came along as well, because again, population growth. So these families, this again makes it a little bit, they are not trying to go over to the Americas to make money. They're not trying to go over to the Americas to, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm just going to say take, for lack of a better word, to take natural resources. They are coming to America to create their own new life, worshiping God the way in which they see fit. Okay, let's go to our next slide. So, setting sail. So the Pilgrims, I'm just going to call them kind of all three different names. You may hear me call it Pilgrims, Puritans, Separatists. We're talking about the same thing. So the Pilgrims leave England on September 6, 1620, upon the Mayflower. They intended to settle in the Virginia area. Now, why the Virginia area? Well, that's because that's where the Jamestown colony is. And the Jamestown colony, again, in 1620, it had begun really blossoming. We're going to talk a little bit more about, kind of how that happened tomorrow, because the Jamestown colony is still going to be very important to us, even though we've kind of moved on from it. They intend to settle in the Virginia area, but a storm blows them off track. So what actually happens is, like, while they are in the Atlantic Ocean and are attempting to land in Virginia, a storm blows them off track to where they are going much further north than they anticipated. What is also interesting about this is they initially had two ships, and one being the Mayflower, the other one called the Speedwell. Well, the Speedwell had some issues. It had some repairs that could not be made, and there was significant leakage. Now, again, you don't need me to tell you that you don't want water in your boat. That kind of defeats the purpose. So because of this, you got to think, if there's 102 passengers, you're thinking, there's probably going to be around 50 on each ship. Because the Speedwell has these damages to it, everyone has to board the Mayflower. And so it makes the Mayflower very cramped, and it makes this journey, this voyage, extremely difficult, and extremely, it's. So let me explain it this way. Not only does it make it more difficult for the Pilgrims, not only does it make it more pressing, more emotionally difficult, the Pilgrims view this as the new Exodus. So again, we have to remember that the Pilgrims are a very religious group of people. And so where do they get their inspiration? Where do they get their, where's their, essentially, like, their educational background is all through the Bible. So when they look at this journey across the Atlantic Ocean, they view this as being the new Exodus. Exodus is referring to Moses leading the Jewish people out of Egypt. And, again, if you are familiar with the Bible, you know that story. And that is how the Puritans, that's how they view their own story. They view themselves as William Bradford, being their leader, is essentially, in this case, Moses, and is leading them across the Atlantic Ocean and into a new land just for them. So, again, there's going to be problems that spawn across the way. They know this. They know this. But again, they believe that God has granted them this right and has granted them this land and has made this opportunity available. So they're going to do everything in their capacity to fulfill or to recognize this promise that God has made them. In November of 1620, so we're about 2 months it takes for the Mayflower to go from England to the Americas. And it is in the Cape Cod area, which we're going to look at on a map real quick, the Cape Cod area that the Pilgrims land on November 11th, 1620. This date is actually a day that we celebrate every year, but not for the same reasons. November 11th, essentially we could celebrate this as maybe Mayflower Day or Plymouth Day. I know there are like local celebrations that go on around there. We could celebrate this as many different things, but the reason that we celebrate this today is because this is, anybody know? See, this is where we'd have fun in class. November 11th is Veterans Day, also known as Armistice Day. We're talking about armistice, that is the end of World War I, like the laying down of arms, which was November 11, 1918. So, anyways, this year actually marks, as you can see, November 11th, 1620. So this November 11th, so we are less than 2 months away. This will mark the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Mayflower. And when the colonists land, they create the Mayflower Compact again, which we're going to look at here in just a moment. So here is, man, I love maps. I freaking love maps because we can learn so much just from this right here. So again, this is England. This is England. Wales. Hold on. England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland. Yep, that's it. So they set sail. And again, you can see that they set sail from Plymouth, England, and they're actually going to name where they land Plymouth. And you can ask why. Again, that's probably a common question. Like, why would they do that? Well, again, they view home is where the heart is, essentially. So this, what you see in blue, is the planned route. What you see in red is the actual route. So once they get really to about the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, while their track was to go again straight to the Virginia colony, which is where Jamestown is, instead they land a couple hundred miles north in Massachusetts in the Cape Cod area. The Cape Cod area of Massachusetts is where you see that little boot right here. I wish we could zoom in. That would zoom. Can I zoom right here? No, I cannot. That's all right. So this small little, it looks small on this map. Again, it's a couple hundred miles. But on this map, it looks like, oh, well, that's not that big of a deal, but it is going to be because we saw in the starving time how bad the winter was for the Jamestown colonists. Now, what do you think is going to happen? Again, you guys know a little bit about how weather works and about how climate works. If the winter is really bad in Jamestown, in this area, do you think it's going to be better or worse in this area? It's going to be worse because, again, it is going to be colder. There's going to be more snowfall. There's also, again, our mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, run all through here. And that is why we don't get huge snowfalls, because the Appalachian Mountains knock down a lot of those storms. Once you get really around the Massachusetts area, and I would say mid to upstate New York is where the Appalachian Mountains start to kind of fade out. And so now you're not going to have that barrier, that protection to knock down those storms. All right, let's go to our last slide, the Mayflower Compact. So why is this important? Well, I've bolded it. I bolded it because it's that important, because it is the first written form of self-government in the United States, or in America, excuse me. This is not the United States just yet. I misspoke. So the first written form of self-government in America. And this will, again, be a large part of moving forward into like the American Revolution, into the Constitutional Convention, is creating self-government, where there is not a king or a queen that is governing for people, but people are governing themselves based on mutual agreements and compromises that they make together. This is the foundation of American government, and it all begins with the Mayflower Compact. Interesting story behind this, though, is the reason they did this, the reason that they created essentially their own government, is because they were initially supposed to go to Virginia. And Virginia, being the Jamestown colony, again, it is named after King James. Like King James, like everyone knows, like they are following English law, because again, this is just a extension of England. But the problem here is they don't land in Virginia. Instead, they land in Massachusetts. And this is a new area, which, again, had been mapped out in previous expeditions by Englishmen. But, this, like, they're not necessarily under English law. And some of the settlers agree. Like, they believe that since they are not in an English controlled area, the English laws do not apply. And so if English laws don't apply, there is no law, because no law has been set up. And so this is what they actually, what happens is that on November 11th, they create the Mayflower Compact. But the I guess really like the big thing here is that they do not want to land and settle permanently until they have this agreement made that they are going to essentially they are going to keep English law. Like they don't change a lot of things. Like that's not the purpose, but they have to set up some type of agreement. And this is what makes it a form of self-government, is because they have to set this up themselves. They are essentially setting up that they are going to follow English law, but because they are not already under English law, they have to do this themselves, which is, again, what makes it a form of self-government, which is why I didn't say they created their own constitution. They didn't do that, but they did they did create the first written form of self-government in America. This is a contract, and a contract of laws that they will follow or that they will adhere to. And in it, they talk about, which you guys are going to read just a little bit later, they talk about like their purpose for creating this, again, what they are doing and why they are doing it. And at the end of it, 41 men signed this compact. Women were not allowed to sign. Again, this is just mainly due to, I mean, I guess you just look at, this is the time in which they lived. So, I want to say Mayflower. Plymouth Part 1. We'll learn a little bit about what we've already come to know, but maybe add in a little bit of detail here and there. Like, why are the Pilgrims so important? Well, we can look at a couple reasons, but I would say the biggest, especially in the sense of like what they are going to create and what they're going to influence, it is because of the Mayflower Compact. All right, we'll pick up part 2 tomorrow. See you guys then.